Good morning, guys. Today's reading is brought to you by the letter C, which stands for, or starts, I guess, so I should say, coffee and comfortable. I'm wearing Ken's sweatshirt. I've had my coffee, and it's kind of chilly, another C word. So when we stopped, George Washington was living at Mount Vernon, and we're going on to chapter 7 now, called A Peaceful Life. Such unpleasant episodes barely affected Washington's peaceful existence at Mount Vernon, where he and his friends indulged in round after round of parties and other fun-filled activities. They also spent many enjoyable evenings in Fredericksburg at George Weedon's Indian Queen Tavern, where men with military backgrounds gathered. They joked, sang loudly, and played cards far into the night. One of Washington's favorite activities was throwing the bar. Throwing the bar, a very popular sport in Washington's time, was similar to modern discus throwing. Although he was already about 40 years old, he outperformed men half his age at this sport. The man who threw the farthest received a prize. And they gave us an illustration of them throwing. Let's see if your arm is as strong as it is long, Washington's friends teased on one memorable night. They were standing on the shores of the Rappahannock River. Washington happily accepted the challenge. He whirled the heavy bar around in his huge hand and threw it at least a dozen yards beyond the best toss of his nearest competitor. According to one story, Washington's bar landed clear across the river. Washington's favorite sport was fox hunting. It appealed to his love of excitement and danger and gave him the opportunity to use the courage and skill that had distinguished his military service. During the hunts, Washington rode a huge, hot-tempered horse named Blueskin. Like all the other horses in his life, Washington had broken Blueskin himself. "Keep up with the hounds," Washington would shout at his huntsmen. Washington himself had no trouble keeping up. He and Blueskin plunged through the woods at breakneck speed, over fences and through dense brush. There were trails cut through the trees around Mount Vernon for fox hunters who were less willing to risk life and limb. But Washington craved the adventure and left the trails for others. His diaries for 6 typical years, from 1768 to 1774, indicate that he went fox hunting 155 times, compared with 31 times duck hunting and 5 fishing. George Washington's recreational activities included not only sports, but also cultural events. He particularly enjoyed the theater. Rarely did he miss an opportunity to attend a play when he was in Williamsburg. Another of his favorite pastimes was dancing. His boundless energy was evident on the dance floor as everywhere else. He held many dances at Mount Vernon and typically danced through the entire night, sending the exhausted musicians home at dawn. Guys, give me just a minute. I got sinus drainage. Okay. Washington had a lifelong love of horses, but he was also very fond of dogs. His favorite seems to have been a French hound named Old Vulcan. On one occasion, Martha had just baked a large ham to serve at a dinner party. Vulcan seized and ate the ham. Although Martha was furious at the dog and embarrassed among the guests, George matter-of-factly announced that the dinner party would be a potluck affair, since Vulcan had gobbled up the main course. That dog would have been in trouble in my house, too. People in the Virginia colony eagerly saw invitations to the social events at Mount Vernon. The dinner parties there featured excellent food as well as the best wine, which Washington ordered in 100-gallon kegs. I don't even know how much 100 gallons is, guys. That's a lot. After dinner, the guests exchanged toasts, sampled a great variety of nuts, and talked about the major topics of the day. In view of his active social life, George Washington needed an extensive and fashionable wardrobe. He had a special agent in London to purchase and ship his clothes. His orders to the agent indicated his taste. "I must have fashionable garments," he wrote, "but nothing fancy, and above all, no lace or embroidery. Plain clothes with a gold or silver button are all I desire." He spared no expense for his wardrobe, ordering his agent, for example, to obtain a genteel suit of clothes made of superfine broadcloth, handsomely chosen. He was equally particular about the other items that he ordered. When his carriage broke down, he instructed an agent in England to replace it with one in the newest taste, handsome, genteel, and light, to be made of the best seasoned wood, and by a celebrated workman, and decorated with the Washington coat of arms. He specified that the carriage should be painted green, unless any other color more in fashion and equally long-lasting deserves priority. Although he dressed to perfection for formal occasions or when hosting an event, Washington wore plain clothes when he was supervising and administering the affairs of his plantation. On one blazing hot summer day, a visitor to Mount Vernon inquired where he could find General Washington. One of the servants pointed the man in the right direction and said, "You will meet, sir, with a gentleman riding alone in plain drab clothes, a broad-brimmed white hat, a hickory switch in his hand, and carrying an umbrella with a long staff, which is attached to his saddle-bow. That person, sir, is General Washington." During the years at home after military service, Washington put his energies into all his properties and his business affairs, assuring above all that everything was orderly. There was much to be done. George rose every morning at 4 a.m. to handle his correspondence and his accounting books. In addition to supervising the affairs of Mount Vernon, he had to manage Martha's thousands of acres of land and more than 100,000 in cash, a vast sum of money for that time. There were complicated transactions to conduct with the Bank of England, and in those days communication across the ocean was slow and not very efficient. And here's an illustration, and under it says Mount Vernon was like a small city. George Washington's slaves and servants kept clearing more and more land at Mount Vernon until the plantation was like a small city. There was no need for towns or shops because everything that Mount Vernon's residents needed was made right there. In one building sat the people who spun yarn for clothing and household goods. In another sat the weavers, and in still another sat the seamstresses who handled all the sewing and mending. It's kind of interesting because he ordered his clothes from England. There were also blacksmiths, carpenters, and stonemasons. Food from the plantations, gardens, and fields, and fish from the river filled the storehouses at Mount Vernon. Slaves worked very hard on the plantation. George Washington took good care of his slaves. He had the reputation of being one of the more careful and caring of plantation owners. Washington was much more than a good manager of his property. He had a passion for excellence. He was also very creative and ambitious and imaginative in pursuing his activities. His expertise in business and agriculture was hailed throughout Virginia. From England, he ordered the latest books on agricultural science, which he used as a guide to modernize farming operations at Mount Vernon. Virginia's standard cash crop was tobacco. Grains like wheat and corn were grown mainly to feed the people living on the farm or plantation. Washington decided to raise wheat as a cash crop. He created wheat fields at Mount Vernon and even built a mill. Before long, the wheat was selling briskly on the Virginia market. Washington also raised corn and rye, partly for use in making whiskey. He even opened a distillery at Mount Vernon to produce the whiskey. In addition, Washington established fisheries on the banks of the Potomac alongside Mount Vernon and caught thousands of pounds of herring, shad, and other fish. Washington even experimented with raising various kinds of animals. Like everyone else in Virginia, he raised horses, but he also determined that a good profit could be made from sheep. This idea was entirely original, and it worked. So did his breeding of mules, and they turned out to be cheaper and better farm animals than horses. George Washington's responsibilities as a property manager were awesome, but so were his talents. He had an enormous amount of energy. He successfully supervised more than 300 workers at Mount Vernon and as many as 600 on the Custis lands. George was strict but fair with his paid employees. He insisted on periodic written reports about every job performed on his or Martha's lands, whether it be building a fence or surveying the livestock. He required reports to be accurate and on time. He refused to tolerate sloppy work habits. In short, he demanded as much from others as he did from himself, and that was a great deal indeed. In everything he undertook, Washington sought perfection. He placed a very high value on quality and efficiency. As a note to one of his plantation managers shows, "My goal is to work for profit and therefore to put a premium on quality rather than mere quantity. There is no difference between the amount of work required to tend an excellent enterprise and an ordinary one." Washington's efforts paid off well. He had a good start with both the land that he inherited from his father and brother and the assets that Martha brought to her marriage. His skillful management then greatly increased the value of all these resources. By the time of Washington's death, Mount Vernon had grown to cover 9,000 acres of land, 13 square miles. He owned a grand total of 23,000 acres and estimated his personal wealth at $500,000. According to his heirs, the true value was more than $1 million. Thus, although George Washington spent many years away from home, either in military service or in public office, he succeeded in accumulating a huge fortune. Martha's son, Jack Custis, became one of the richest men in Virginia, thanks to his stepfather's guidance in managing his assets. Patsy Custis never grew up to enjoy her inheritance. She developed epilepsy, a disease characterized by uncontrollable seizures. In 1773, at the age of 16, she died. George was deeply saddened, but Martha's grief was even greater. As her husband wrote in a note to her relatives, "This sudden and unexpected blow has almost reduced my poor wife to the lowest ebb of misery." After Patsy's death, Martha clung to Jack, her only remaining child, for comfort. She had always been very anxious about her children and tried to protect them in much the same way as Washington's own mother had fussed over him. Martha, however, was good-natured and easy to get along with, in sharp contrast with Mary Washington. George, who had a great fondness for children, was especially eager to give Jack Custis a proper upbringing. This included, in George's mind, the kind of good education that he himself had missed. "I am determined to make Jack fit for more useful purposes than horse racing," George wrote to his stepson's tutor. But neither Jack nor Martha proved supportive of George's efforts. When Jack turned 14, his father noted with sadness that his mind is more turned to dogs, horses, and guns, indeed upon dress. Jack's tutor agreed, and not long afterward reported, in addition, that the boy had a propensity for the fair sex. Jack proposed to a lovely woman named Nellie Calvert without even telling his mother and stepfather in advance. George Washington was quite distressed by this development. "I'm not asking you to break your engagement," he told the young couple, "but at least wait until Jack finishes his education before you get married." He enrolled Jack in King's College, later named Columbia University in New York, for a 2-year course of study. No sooner had Jack entered college when Patsy died. Martha was devastated. During her first marriage, she had lost 2 other children. "Jack is my only living child now," cried Martha. "I cannot bear for him to be so far away. Let him leave New York and come back home." Washington could not change her mind, so Jack returned to Virginia and married Nellie. George Washington held no bitterness toward his stepson. In fact, he assured the newlyweds that they were always welcome at Mount Vernon. In addition to caring for his family and the land, George Washington served dutifully in Virginia's House of Burgesses. Here's a picture. He was first elected shortly before his marriage and took his seat on his 27th birthday. A few days later, a fellow delegate offered the following resolution: that the thanks of the House be given to George Washington, Esquire, late Colonel of the 1st Virginia Regiment, for his faithful service to His Majesty and this colony, and for his brave and steady behavior from the first encroachments and hostilities of the French and their Indians to his resignation after the happy reduction of Fort, I don't know how to pronounce this, guys, it's French, I'm sure, Duquesne. Duquesnes? Duquesnes? Somebody, if you find out how to pronounce it, let me know. This was the last French stronghold in the Ohio region where Washington's army fought. Washington stood up to express thanks for the resolution, but blushed and stammered and found himself entirely speechless. "Please sit down, Mr. Washington," said the Speaker of the House. "You are clearly as modest as you are courageous. Welcome to our assembly." For 15 years, George Washington faithfully attended the meetings of the House of Burgesses. These were the great years of colonial government in Virginia. Washington sat in the company of Thomas Jefferson, Patrick Henry, and other famous men, all highly qualified to debate the important political issues of the day. Unlike the others, however, Washington could not make great speeches. He spoke infrequently and only about the question at hand, not broad statements of philosophical politics. In both his public and private life, George Washington displayed great self-discipline and self-control. Although Washington had more than enough to keep him occupied in Virginia, he could not stop thinking about the vast lands west of the colony. In the House of Burgesses, he helped pass laws that let the men of his old military regiment get acres in exchange for their service in the French and Indian War. Washington himself bought up the acres of those who chose not to move west. He regarded the western lands as much more than personal property, however. He wrote that the western country is a spacious haven for the poor and the persecuted people of the earth. Thus, Washington foresaw the period when people from overseas would come to America to settle. This period indeed came to pass. Large waves of immigrants from Europe and elsewhere saw America, as Washington himself did, as the great land of opportunity. In 1769, Washington took a 7-week journey west to determine the value of land there. He was accompanied by Dr. James Craik, who had served as the surgeon of the Virginia Regiment and remained one of Washington's closest friends. Once the two men met an Indian chief, who had fought with the French against Washington's forces. The chief immediately recognized Washington and recounted an episode from the time of the battle. "I called to my young men and said, 'Mark yon tall and daring warrior.' Our rifles were aimed and they had never missed before, but it was all in vain this time. A mighty power protected him from harm. He will never die in battle. Instead, a great spirit guides that warrior. He will become the chief of nations and the founder of a powerful empire." Look at this illustration, guys. Shows him talking to the chief. Dr. Craik was shaken by the Indian chief's words and repeated them on many occasions in the following years. Washington, by contrast, dismissed them as mere flattery. He laughed at the thought that he, a colonel from Virginia, who had not even succeeded in obtaining a royal commission for the army, would one day lead a nation and an empire. Nevertheless, the rapidly worsening relations between England and its American colonies were already creating a situation in which George Washington would achieve everlasting fame. Little could George himself begin to guess at the future that lay before him. Nor could anyone else see the future nation, the United States of America, in the sprawling forests and unexplored lands which both surrounded and stretched beyond the weak, separate, and little connected colonies that England still thought of as belonging to the mighty British Empire forever. That is the end of chapter 7, guys. Chapter 8 is called Commander-in-Chief, and we'll read that one tomorrow. And we're getting down. Commander-in-Chief. Do you guys know what a Commander-in-Chief is? We'll find out tomorrow. Bye.